Commoner team welcomes you to an engaging online panel discussion on coastal commons. The Indian Commoner Forum is a digital platform that enables conversations on the commons. Today, we have the privilege of delving into the multifaceted nature of India's diverse coastal territories and exploring the significance of coastal commons. As our panelists unravel the complexities of coastal commons, we will gain insights into the solutions that can ensure the sustainable management and preservation of these vital ecosystems. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists. Sreeja KJ, a research director at Equinox, a climate solutions tech startup, is dedicated to studying the impact of climate change and human interventions on tropical, nature-based livelihoods and community resilience. She is also the co-founder of DARA Livelihood Initiative, supporting indigenous women's enterprises, and serves as the co-founder and CEO of Resilient Destinations Foundation, focused on creating climate resilient and climate responsible tourist destinations. Amalendu Joshi is an economist at Azim Premji University in Bengaluru, specializing in institutional economics. His research focuses on institutions and commons issues related to natural resources in India and its diverse geography. He has a particular interest in marine and coastal fisheries, studying livelihoods, markets, and consumption. Amalendu is actively involved as a co-research member of the Asian Initiative on Legal Pluralism and has served on the executive committee of the Indian Society for Ecological Economics from 2018 to 2020. Naveen Namboothri is a founder and trustee of Dakshin Foundation and is an experienced marine biologist with a specialization in coastal and marine ecosystems in India. He leads the Sustainable Fisheries and Sustainable Livelihoods program at Dakshin, where he is involved in diverse projects. These include participatory community-led fisheries management in the Lakshadweep and the Andaman Islands, long-term monitoring of coral reef ecosystems in the Andamans, and studying reduction fisheries on the west coast of India. To begin the discussion, I invite Naveen to take the floor and provide a contextual overview of our webinar, aiming to foster a comprehensive understanding of the coast.
Thanks, Nayantara. Am I audible?
Yes.
All right. Let me see if I can share the screen. Is the
Yes, it's visible
as well. Cool. Thanks. All right. So thanks for that introduction, Nayantara. Yeah, that pretty much summarizes everything. I work with Dakshin Foundation, an organization that's based in Bangalore. We primarily work on coastal and marine systems, mostly with the small-scale fisher communities. And as Nayantara said, I head the Sustainable Fisheries program there. So yeah, before getting into the details of the workshop, it would be good to generally get a sense of what the what the coastline and what we actually mean by coastal commons. And while generally coastal commons in general literature and parlance quite most often refers to the space, the landward side of the coastline. I would like to extend that to the adjoining marine areas as well, because quite a lot of the use and engagement of the communities happens in that includes the marine components as well, right? So yeah, so my own journey with coastal and marine systems began with very from a very research kind of a perspective, with a very inquiry-based kind of a lens. And when I started looking at coastal systems, it was mostly the aesthetics of it that's got me hooked, and then later the whole intrigue about all the organisms that live there. So fantastic ecosystems, highly productive, provide a lot of different kind of services to humans. Mangrove ecosystems, for instance, there are other kinds of ecosystems like your sandy shore ecosystems, the beaches, the sand dunes. A lot of them do kind of, provoke your, kind of appeals to your aesthetic taste, right? And that's something that, like I said, where it all started for me. But also, these are in-water systems. Once I got into diving, all the, in-water systems are also absolutely amazing. Again, like I said, highly productive, again, extremely diverse, extremely, interesting. But in all of these slides, I had other slides moving. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So in all the slides that I shared earlier, there's one missing component, which are the humans, right? And quite often, for someone with my kind of interest, often that's the invisible part, the blind spot. But I kind of had to train myself to look at these systems in a much more holistic manner. And who do you come across first? As the humans are usually the small scale fisher communities, the fisher communities in general who live along these coastlines, right? They are the ones who've been living there, engaging with these systems over, probably even over centuries in many cases. And it's a very strong linkage with the oceans and the resources and the coastal space. While they live on the coastal space, they, a lot of their livelihoods and cultures, traditions, even their practices are all very tightly linked to what happens in the sea, right? There are different kinds of, and it's extremely diverse. The more you travel along the coast, the more you'll realize how diverse this kind of engagement or the relationships with the sea is. And from very simple subsistence kind of, engagement with very specific kind of resources, or, very opportunistic kind of fishing. It could be like, uh, what you call the motorized kind of fishing sector, which is a very small scale kind of engagement into, extractive kind of engagement with the ocean and the seas. But also in the last 3 or 4 decades, it's kind of become much large scale as well. The kind of engagements have become much large scale. The number of people, the kind of, boats and the capacities have all changed the entire scale of operation significantly, right? But nevertheless, as you travel along the coast, you will come across huge diversity. It's extremely dissipated in countries like India. Every 2 or 3 kilometers, one can expect a fishing village or a fishing hamlet. On an average, we have 3,000 odd, fishing villages in a 7,500 to 8,000 kilometer coastline. So that's the kind of, that's how it's kind of spread along the coastlines as well, right? And people live there. People have, from very basic kind of, very, marginalized, poor communities, and the communities are also not uniformly kind of, uniform in terms of their socioeconomic backgrounds, in terms of their culture. Like I said, there's a huge amount of diversity, right? The castes, the class systems, all of these are also extremely diverse and deeply embedded in the communities as well. So you do find huge diversity, that's the crux of it, but also different kinds of, like I said, the spaces are also used for the coastal space. The beach space is also not a space that's, just aesthetically pleasing. It's also a space of high utilitarian value, right? For fishing communities, from all their day-to-day activities are kind of centered in that small space, right? And most of these are common property resources as well, that the fisher communities don't have exclusive rights over, but for centuries have been using these spaces as well. It could be from docking their boats to, smaller kinds of fishing practices like the show scene that you see there. Could be for mending their nets, or just for other kind of general recreational activities. Now, this space is not just occupied by the fisher communities. Increasingly, it is becoming what we call a contested space, right? There are more and more, interest groups who are keen on using the coastal space as well. So from real estate, this is prime real estate. So most of the developmental activities from a real estate point of view happens here. A lot of the industrial activities are centered along the coastline. You have even things like, tourism and all of those also increasingly becoming another, big presence on the coastline as well. And all of them have their, huge footprints left on the coastlines as well. And this kind of leads to huge contestation and tensions along the coastline, and that manifests itself in different ways. Quite often it is the small scale or the marginalized fisher communities who are at the, at the receiving end of a lot of these tensions, or on the losing end of a lot of these. Like I said, it's diverse, it's dissipated, but it's also extremely overcrowded already. Like I said, there's a fishing village every 3 or 4 kilometers, but there are also increasing number of, new infrastructure being planned. I don't know if you all are aware of the blue economy plans. The gaze is kind of shifting from the land to the seaward side. So which means there's, huge kind of planned, proposed activities also for the coastline, right? Like I said, the coastal communities in all of this, especially the fisher communities, have been quite often the most overlooked in all of this, right? When you're thinking of development plans, it's not necessarily kind of directed towards the well-being of poor coastal fisher communities, but these are like much bigger development plans where they don't have a, seat at the table. So historically, like I said, because of marginalization, what has happened is most of the fisher communities do live below the poverty line, about 67%. And when I say poverty line, that's less than $2 a month, right? So that's the kind of, situation that's there at the coast, along the coast with the coastal communities. There's very high levels of illiteracy also, particularly higher education kind of opportunities or access to those kind of, facilities are very poor. So generally, if you look at the HDIs, the human development indices, the fisher communities generally are one of the more marginalized. And like I said, there's huge conflicting aspirations kind of playing out on the coastlines as well, the different viewpoints, right? Like a real estate person or even a conservationist, for instance, for someone who's highly interested in, say, conserving and protecting the coastal and marine resources, not necessarily in a very inclusive way, also is another competitor in this, stakeholder in the space as well, where you're pushing for more marine protected areas. On the other hand, there are other groups who are pushing for, larger industrialization, more infrastructure development along the coast. So it's also a highly contested and, conflicting space when it comes to, what to do with the space, right? Where do we go from here? How do we develop these areas, or what kind of, conservation or sustainable activities do we need to kind of bring into these areas? So it is extremely contested and a conflicted space as well. So I would like to kind of leave you all with a few questions, which kind of segues into the rest of the, the panel discussion as well, is, so who does this coast belong to, right? And this often lies at the crux of most of the problem and the tensions that I spoke about, is because everyone wants to stake a claim to the coast, right? Everybody has some interest or the other in this. Now, it's really important, if you look at it, historically, it's been the fisher communities who've been living there and, using those spaces for their livelihoods. There's nowhere else for them to go, right? In that sense. But so that way, for an organization like Dakshin, our primary kind of, beneficiaries, if one may, is to or the groups that we really want to support are the marginalized coastal, fisher communities. Also, it's critical to think about who decides what is done and what is not, right? There are so many different interest groups. Like I said, there's forest department on the one hand, which wants to protect more and more, areas, keep people away from it. There are departments like the fisheries, which on the other hand, encourages people to go out and fish more, provides more kind of infrastructure, subsidies and all of that. And there are, like I said, all the industrial and other kind of developers who have their own interests. And there are also the coastal fisher communities, like I said, who are the most marginalized, and often their voices are not the ones that's heard the most, right? So On that note, I'll wrap it here and happy to take questions or probably after Amal.
Uh, Thank you, Naveen, for setting the context and leaving us with important questions to think about. We'll do the question and answer section later. So we will move on to Amalendu. Our next panelist, Amalendu, will delve into the threats faced by coastal commons and the underlying forces that contribute to the decommoning of our coasts. Over to you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Nayantara, and thank you, Naveen, for setting this wonderful context from where I can actually delve a little more deeper into some of the reality of how these coastal commons are being how we navigate through these coastal commons, and specifically, as Naveen said, it's the most marginalized group, which is at center of our own discourse. So while trying to kind of go through this process, I'll focus more on these small-scale fishers and fishing communities. When I say fishers, it includes both men and women. And in fact, it's women who have been playing a major role in fishing activities, particularly the post-landing activities of women who kind of take charge of fish in a traditional form. So, so you can see my slides, right?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Yeah. So while this story that Naveen presented, it works means when you look at the entire Indian coast, and not only Indian coast, but also a large part of Indian Ocean regions, including South Asia, Southeast Asia, the stories are pretty much similar. But for me, I have been kind of a little more invested in Karnataka coast for last 4 or 5 years, and I'll bring up some of the aspects from Karnataka, where number of things happening on those coastal commons, and how these factors are kind of spanning out. I'll show you some of those aspects. One of the first things that we know that there are activities that happens which we call human induced or anthropogenic, and there are also natural activities that happen. In coastal areas are prone to erosion and accretions. Some of these happen because of human induced factors, but also it happens naturally too. And the question arises that what happens when there is a erosion happens. If a community living there, community using those space, and those spaces getting eroded into the water, what happens? Who gains? Who loses out of that? At the same time, if there is accretion happens, who gains or who loses out of that? And this is one this map that you are seeing is that in a place called Honavar in Karnataka, where it is in the river mouth of Saravati, and the Saravati river itself had changed its course almost about 4 kilometers in last 4 decades. And there had been a creation of almost about 80-90 acres of land area, and this area was used by the community for fish drying and other activities. And of late, we are seeing that there is a particular port that is being planned in this particular place. It's called Honavar Port Private Limited, and state is kind of making a claim on it and giving it to a private party. And so what we see is that basically the small-scale fishers kind of getting marginalized in this. And this is just one anecdotal point, and the number of things that is happening across Indian coast, and if you look at South and Southeast Asian coast or African coast, stories are more or less similar. You can see some of this. It's just not a port or a harbor that is coming up, but it also requires infrastructure. It requires roads that has to come up on those coastal lines. So these are the spaces where the small-scale fishers, particularly They keep their boats, what we call the beach landing that happens. These are the spaces where once the fish comes out, it's salted, cured, and dried in this particular space. And mostly women are engaged in fish drying activities, and these are the spaces they use. And when such roads do come in, it essentially takes away their space from there. And it happens or comes to something like this. It shrinks into a particular, it's rather cornered. You can see that where they get into, and it's not a permanent space for them. They're always living in a threat of getting evicted from this particular space as well. Also, there has been plans when fisheries department or fisheries ministry, when they start thinking of kind of expanding how blue economy or the marine sector can induce economic growth. They look at this sector particularly to see how more and more fish can be caught in the sea. And in fact, for a long time, at least in Indian case, from 1960s onward, there had been kind of policies which have been more induced towards export-oriented path, where we export more fish, and that would lead to more growth of the economy. And for this, the boat sizes have been increasing year after year. And we have been also planning more and more bigger fishing harbors. But what happens when we make such kind of harbors, when the designs are more tuned towards large boats, what you see is that small boats cannot even access this particular kind of harbors. So you can see that in the photo in one of this corner, that is platform size. The platform size is such that it only can address the needs of large boats like purseners and trawlers, and the small boats have to kind of move away from this place and have to be in one of those corners. So the more the harbors come in and they're not designed appropriately, then the small scale fishers kind of getting sidelined from these spaces, and the large scale fishing activities occupy those kind of spaces. But Naveen was telling about that the conservation itself also is creating another kind of exclusion. And in India, particularly, apart from marine conservation areas, now what we are seeing is also something called ecotourism beaches. And they're all kind of blue flag certified beaches. There are about 22 odd that is there throughout this Indian coast, and more are being planned. In Karnataka, there are two. One place called Padubidri, the other one is called Kasaragod near Honavar. And but it creates also some kind of exclusion area. So these eco beaches are not easily accessible to anybody. One has to pay a ticket, and they are more designed towards the tourists who come into those places, and local community who was using these spaces for their activities, and you see suddenly they getting excluded from these places. Not only that, the irony is that to keep those ecotourism beaches clean, you would see those spaces are clean, but the dirt is kind of thrown either side of those those areas. And this is one of those such kind of things that you can see in this Kasaragod ecotourist beaches. The inside area seems pretty clean, but as soon as you come to the outside area, all the dirts are being thrown that side. So it is not only that exclusion happens, but also the waste that is being generated, where it is being thrown, and what impact it does, not only to the community, but also other lives who have been inhabiting those spaces. In last 2 decades, if you particularly see, is that there has been quite a change, significant change that is happening is in terms of utilization of the fish that is being harvested from the sea. And a lot of these fishes are not necessarily going for food purpose, but are getting into the fish meal factories. And there is a very interesting value chain that has been working around it. And most of this fish goes to fish meal companies or fish meal factories, from where the fish paste and powders are kind of made out of that, and that is transformed into aqua feeds, and those are going into the shrimp farming areas. And shrimp farming, India has been one of the largest exporter of shrimps, and that has been one of the largest foreign exchange earner for India. So it has become like a vicious circle. One is that the fish that could have been available as food or affordable food is getting transformed into fish meal, fed into the shrimps, and the shrimp culture itself manifests a different form of ecosystem problems, particularly increasing the salinity of the area where the shrimp cultures are happening. And after all that, the shrimp is not affordable for a domestic consumer to eat. The majority of it is getting exported. Almost 90% of it is getting exported to high-income countries for high-income consumers. So essentially, it's a small, affordable food variety fish is getting transformed into feed, and finally it is getting exported as shrimps to a high-income, affordable customers. So that's a kind of a vicious circle that we are getting into. And Karnataka itself is one of the places where the highest number of fish meal companies that you will be seeing. A place called Ullal in Mangalore, where almost about 15 factories are there, but across the coast you will see about 60-70 factories in India. And the numbers are very high, and their capacities are also increasing over the years. Another thing that is happening is that in the river mouths, the Sharavati river that I was telling you about, and it's not only changing its course, this estuarine area is a highly productive area. It's not only good mangroves are there, the kind of species of fish and varieties of species that we get here, but there is a process of decommunization happening there through this what we call is a cage culture. If you go to the estuarine areas across the country, specifically in Karnataka, you'll find a number of places these cages have come in. These cages basically culture sea bass, which is getting exported. And what do these sea bass eat? They eat mackerels. So the mackerel, which is one of the affordable fish largely for the low-income consumers, this is being fed to the sea bass, and the sea bass is getting exported. So it's not only the shrimp and fish meal nexus that is happening. Now we are seeing this across the coast in estuarine areas where these cage cultures are coming up in big ways. And all these are transforming affordable food to feed for export varieties export varieties fish. So and in the process, what is happening is that these cages are also creating a space which is making this space private, which was essentially as common. So it's a process of what we call the decommunization that we are seeing in estuarine areas. So that's another form of change that is happening, or the threat that is coming to the commons. So broadly, if I have to summarize, there are these blue economy factors, that is what we call big ports, harbors, big fishing harbors, different kind of industries, tourism. All those factors are playing some kind of role, and it's essentially shrinking these commons, further marginalizing these small scale fishes and shrinking their space. And this kind of exclusion and grabbing is kind of keeping these people, particularly the women who have been using these coastal areas for fish trying and other activities, they're shrinking their space. This particular photograph is taken from this famous Tagore beach in Karwar region, which is quite a tourist place. where one side you see that tourist beach, the Tagore beach, and the other side you will see resorts, and in between they are shrank. It is small space where they're still registering and contesting that space for themselves, or claiming that space for themselves to do these fish trying activities. We are not sure how long this kind of activities they can continue, and we don't know whose interest will kind of overtake and whose interest would be marginalized in this. And this fish diversion, that is what I was telling, has become it's significantly high. It's almost some of our estimate that we were working on, almost 33% of, or 1/3 of fish catch, official fish catch, is getting into fish meal, which is creating another kind of insecurity. It's just not the commons that is decommunized, but also the food and nutrition security is being compromised with this kind of transformation. So with this, I will kind of stop it here, and these are some of the questions that we can say take forward. It's definitely what we presented. It's quite beautiful post, and what is happening to that, to particularly the marginalized communities, but it's not that everything is lost, but it requires some amount of collective imagination to at least sustain whatever is, or at least arrest some of those changes that is happening to this. So some of those things that would include maybe basically to thinking about policies or pathways which are more small-scale fishers oriented, recognizing the women who have been actively involved in this fishing activities and actively using the coastal commons, understanding at least the traditional rights on coastal commons. And we had some kind of regulatory regulation relating to that. It's called Coastal Regulatory Zone Acts, but they are constantly changing with favoring more and more of industrial activities, more of tourism activities, and marginalizing the traditional activities there. So can it be restored? Can there be a possibility of some kind of collectivization of the small-scale fishers and women, so that we can see some hopes at the end of the day? So I'll stop here, and we'll take up further discussions subsequently. This image broadly explains some of those things. Thank you.
Thank you, Amalendu, for exemplifying the threats to coastal commons and the communities that depend on it. I invite Sreeja and Naveen to add to the discussion if y'all want to share anything.
Shall I?
Before you begin, is there something you want to add to Amalendu's discussion, or do you want to?
Just
go
something
ahead.
that, thank you, Amalendu, for presenting this aspect of ownership of resources, because I feel that it is not just the sea, like Naveen said, nor the coast, nor the fishes that are being lost to the coastal inhabitants, especially the fishers. It is also the right to pure water also. So my journey to the coast actually began from the upstream. I am trained as an agricultural economist, and I'd been looking at the integrated river basin management policies. And I realized that the coastal area, the coastal people are missing from any integrated basin management plan, because most of our basins end almost 10 kilometers from the sea. Because afterwards, there is a diversity of flow paths. It is not easy for you to delineate your basin after a certain point of time. But that also means that many of the coastal populace don't have any right to a river basin identity also. Now, case in point is, you have mentioned the cage fisheries. So just a couple of days back, a very dear community mapper of ours had to suffer a loss of close to 2 lakh rupees because he lost that much amount of mature sea bass, which he had been cultivating in his cage. Why? Because the monsoons have started here and the bunds and the regulators have been opened, and all those industries in the Erur belt have been waiting for the monsoons to start so that they can flush out all their pollutants into the river. And where do they end up? They end up in the coastal reaches where people have been raising fishes in their cages. And why in cages? That is again another conversation. Maybe I'll hint at it in my share of the discussion. But yes, so then they are denied not just the coast and the marine life losses, but an ownership and loss of freshwater resources also. That also manifests as loss of drinking water, no right over drinking water, no right to demand drinking water because there are no riparian rights. So this is just another point that I wanted to flag.
Yeah, to add to this, I mean, there has been coastal communities who have been engaged in this traditional rice fish culture activities. In Kerala, it has been known as Pokkali.
Yes.
In Karnataka, they call it Gajani. In Konkan coast, it is known as Khajana, and in Sundarban, I think Bedi or something. There are different names across, but traditionally there has been in this saline water, saline resistant rice varieties have been growing, and when rice is not happening, they engage in fishing activities. At one point of time, there had been creation of bonds, which has actually separated the fishing communities who are engaged in this particular activities, who had claim over the fish resources there, while rice farmers had their claims. With the bond creation, now the rice farmers had got claims of both. And now that is also transforming. The transformation that is happening is that they are kind of leasing out this space when the rice is not anymore economically viable. So what is viable is the fish and shrimp. So some are still continuing with some form of traditional catching this fish through the sluice gates, but a lot of them also have converted into shrimp farms. And as you said, that it also changes the characteristics of the water and salinity level of those areas. So these changes are rampant actually. And our own study in this Gajani area in Karnataka, from almost about 15,000 hectares to it is kind of shrank to almost about 3,000 hectares, which is still dwindling actually. It is in Kerala, we know the stories that in spite of GI tag to Pokkali, and the struggle that is the Pokkali farmers are facing is also quite.
Yes, barely 400 hectares being cultivated, although there are around 8,000 to 10,000 hectares earmarked as Pokkali fields. Yeah.
Naveen, do you want to add anything?
Well, I was just reading the comment that was there in the chat box, and a very interesting point that you bring up, Vishwajit, is the role of traditional systems, cultural practices and all of that in managing, and also claiming rights over commons, right? And when I say commons, not just the land part of it, also the sea part of it and the resources, including the fish and all of that. And yeah, at least from whatever little bit of experience I've had with some of the traditional and, similar cultural practices is, one, they themselves going through transitions because of community itself going through, in many places where there are very strict, practices. Like one of the islands I work in is in Minicoy, where there are very, very carefully planned, marine resource planning. Like each and every boat is assigned a boulder of coral. You can only take your bait fish from that particular coral boulder. Very strong kind of enforcement and compliance also with those kind of, cultural practices. And they are linked not just as rules to manage and conserve the oceans, but also it's kind of tightly linked to your culture, practice and all of that. But what happens is when there's this huge force, which is the center or the state, which looks at these systems, has a different kind of vision and aspiration for those spaces, quite often, and honestly, I would include even scientists and practitioners of science, also including people like me, who also only recognize a certain form of, language, which is the language of evidence, the language of science, the language of, how these cultural practices, okay, there's no evidence that these things work. Sometimes some scientific test is done, and then you say that, okay, between the control and the culturally managed areas, there are no, differences and all of that. And quite often when that kind of, in many of these places, it survives because of the insularity or the community cohesion. In many places where communities are very tightly, working mostly as an insular community, these kind of systems survive. But the more and more you have external kind of influences coming in, somehow these systems, start to kind of break apart, and it becomes very difficult to sustain these things in this, highly competitive and changing kind of a world. But I agree, one needs to look at formalizing and empowering these kind of existing systems, right? And that's something that probably one can look at. And these are probably the only few examples of how, their systems can still survive.
There is also one interesting question from Satyajit Jaina that has come. What are the broader legal infrastructure and departments in India to safeguard the coastal commons and their indigenous users or protectors? Sreeja or Naveen, would you like to take this?
Sorry, Amal, what's the question again?
What's the question?
The question is, what are the broader legal infrastructure and departments in India to safeguard the coastal commons and their indigenous users and protectors?
I can begin. There are different departments, like I said, again, with extremely contesting and extremely sometimes even diametrically opposite kind of, visions for coastal and marine spaces. Like if you look at the fisheries department, like I said, their mandate is production. Fisheries production is one of their main mandate. Like Amal said, it's a very production centric kind of, vision they have for the coastal and marine systems. And so what that means is, increasing amounts of investment towards larger boats. Now the push is to, because most of the nearshore fisheries has collapsed, the push is to kind of expand fisheries in deep sea areas. So on one hand, there are departments like this. Like I said, there are other departments like the forest department and others who have a very strong, fortress conservation kind of an approach to resources, right? So anything that's natural resources, mine, it is, I have a claim over it. Oh, there is a coral reef, then this is entirely our area. There is a turtle nesting ground, then this is entirely quite, so there are different kinds of stakes that are being claimed by different groups, departments, agencies. The same for Forest and Environment Department is also mandated with implementing the Coastal Regulation Zone Act that Amar talked about, which by the way has been diluted, more number of times than the number of years it has been in existence, right? So yes, there are multiple groups who claim to have a stake, and there is a constant tussle. And in between all of this, like I said, it's the voice of the fisher communities that's not heard. There's atomic energy and other kinds of, groups who have an interest in mining the ocean, the ocean floor, or even, the coastal sands. Now, increasingly, marine policing and all of those kind of presence is being felt a lot more. So yes, it is a heavily contested space. Who particularly owns it is actually the crux of the question is, who owns this place? Who decides what to do with it? Who determines who should, like Amal said, even this blue flag certification, right? It's a completely elitist kind of a way of looking at a beach space. You need to take tickets to go to a beach, and all the associated problems. People who've been living there using it for centuries don't have access anymore. So those kind of issues are there. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, Amal and Sreeja, if you want to weigh in, please feel free.
I think another aspect of it I can touch upon when I do my presentation.
Yeah.
We can start with your presentation. So, yeah, Sreeja, I'll Yeah, Sreeja will conclude the discussion with the 3-minute trailer for a 7-part docu-series highlighting climate change impacts in coastal villages of Kochi, Kerala, and showcasing innovative community-led solutions. Naveen? Yeah, Naveen.
ബഹുമാനപ്പെട്ട കളക്ടർ സാർ അറിയുവാൻ, ഞങ്ങളുടെ നാട്ടിലെയും എൻ്റെ വീട്ടിലെയും കാര്യങ്ങൾ ഓർമ്മിപ്പിക്കാനാണ് ഈ എഴുത്ത്. ഇപ്പോൾ കുറെ കൊല്ലമായിട്ട് ഉപ്പുവെള്ളമാണ് ഞങ്ങളുടെയൊക്കെ വീടിൻ്റെ ചുറ്റിലും. വീടൊക്കെ കേടായി. എൻ്റെ കൂട്ടുകാര് ആദിത്യൻ്റെയും അതുലിൻ്റെയും പിന്നെ ആര്യയുടെയും വീട്ടില് 2011 ഊരുവെള്ളം കയറാൻ തുടങ്ങിയതാ. 13 കൊല്ലായിട്ട് അവര് ഇങ്ങനാ ജീവിക്കണേ. 15 മിനിറ്റ് വെള്ളത്തിൽ കൂടി നടന്നിട്ടാ സ്കൂളിൽ പോണേ. കാലാവസ്ഥ മാറ്റാന്നാ പറയണേ. കുറെ വീടും പോയി, ആൾക്കാർക്ക് ജോലിയും പോയി. നാരായണൻ ചേട്ടനൊക്കെ എത്ര മീൻ കിട്ടിയിരുന്നതാ. ഇപ്പൊ ഒന്നുമില്ല, തൂമ്പുപണി മാത്രമായി. ഇവിടുത്തെ മെമ്പറൊക്കെ പലതും ശ്രമിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്, പക്ഷെ ഒറ്റയ്ക്ക് എന്താവാനാ. ഞങ്ങളുടെ വാർഡിൽ കഴിഞ്ഞ 4 വർഷം ഏതു ദിവസം എത്ര മഴ പെയ്തു എന്ന് കൃത്യം ഡാറ്റ കയ്യിലുള്ള കുട്ടിയുണ്ട്. ഇങ്ങനെ നോക്കുമ്പോൾ മഴയുടെ പാറ്റേൺ മനസ്സിലാക്കാൻ പറ്റും. നമ്മുടെ പ്രശ്നത്തിന്റെ കൃത്യ വിവരങ്ങൾ ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ പരിഹാരം ഉണ്ടാക്കാൻ പറ്റില്ലേ? ഇത് മുരുകേശൻ ചേട്ടൻ ലക്ഷക്കണക്കിന് കണ്ടൽ നട്ടിട്ടുണ്ട്. ആൾക്കിത് ചെയ്തിട്ട് എന്താ ലാഭം? ആള് ചെയ്യുന്നതിന്റെ ഗുണം ഞങ്ങൾ കുട്ടികൾക്കാണ്. കാലാവസ്ഥാ വ്യതിയാനത്തെ അതിജീവിക്കാൻ പറ്റുന്ന കേരളത്തിന്റെ സ്വന്തം അരിയാണ് പൊക്കാളി. അത് ഇവിടെ കൃഷി ചെയ്യാൻ ആളില്ല. എന്നാൽ വിച്ചപ്പൻ ചേട്ടൻ 12 ഏക്കറിൽ എല്ലാ കൊല്ലം പൊക്കാളി വിളവെടുക്കും. ഇങ്ങനത്തെ വലിയ കാര്യങ്ങൾ ചെയ്യുന്ന ആളുകളെ നമ്മൾ വഴികാട്ടികളാക്കേണ്ടേ. സസ്നേഹം, ദേവനന്ദൻ.
Yeah. So, shall I start?
Yes, please.
Yes, I mean, this video always leaves me numb for a while, even though I've watched it 100 times. But it is also a hopeful thing that I want to present today. While what you've heard until now is about the loss of commons, be it the marine life, be it the coast, and like even I said, be it the fresh water. What climate change is doing to these lands is that there is also a strangeness and alienation that is coming in, because people, especially nature-based livelihoods, those who practice them, the fishers, the farmers, and there is also another community that I would like to introduce here, because when you say coast, it also includes another landscape which is equally important, which is the estuarine landscape. Because it, especially in the west coast of India, like in the slides that Amalendu showed, once the rivers reach towards their end, they form extensive parallel backwater systems to the sea. And we have a very unique biodiversity and livelihoods associated with the estuarine landscape also. So it is the coast and the estuarine landscape that has become an alien space for the people who live in these coasts as a result of increasing climate change. Now, when I went into coastal regions for my research around 15 years back, what I was looking at were the impacts of human interventions in the coast, which included reclamation of the stream pathways. You had the coast itself eroding as a result of certain ports and harbors being built, the pollution aspect of it, the ponds getting reclaimed because of a lure of the money that the land gives you. But 15, 20 years down the lane, now when I'm working in the same landscape, the questions, the nature of the trauma, the nature of the conflicts have changed. Because along with the human interventions, which is one of the major underlying causes of the loss of commons, there is also an additional global cause, and that the people are finding very hard to grapple with. And here, when I say the impacts of climate change on the coastal commons, I am not just speaking about the fishers and the farmers, the specialized farming systems that Amalendu mentioned, the Pokali and the equivalent farming practices all along the western coast. It is not just them. It is also all coastal inhabitants. And mostly you see that when I take the case in point of Kochi. Now, Kochi itself is a coastal city, but when you look at the people who work to make the Kochi city happen, its day-to-day functions are handled by a swarm of people who enter into Kochi from its suburbs. And these suburban regions are all coastal regions, and it is where your entire workforce for Kochi resides, the informal workforce. And these are people who come to clean your premises, your hospitals, your drivers, your service providers, those who work on a daily wage basis. All these people return to the coast also. So we have these Waipin Islands, which is one of the most populated islands in the entire of Asiatic region, and around 3,200 is the population density of Waipin Island. It is this entire people who are being affected by a change in the nature of the ocean, its temperature, its levels, and the changes that are happening as a result of it. So because of global warming, 90% of the heat that has been captured by your greenhouse gases is being taken by the ocean. As a result of which, oceans are, one, warming, which results in expansion of the water body. Second, the ice melt is happening. So because of which, in the Kochi coast itself, around 20 centimeters of water have risen. Now, this is one impact. The second is that the turbulence in the oceans have increased. As I speak, there are people who are very dear to me in the Kochi coastal region who have been thrown out of their houses because of a very violent sea. So that is also happening. Cyclonic activities have increased in the Arabian Sea, because of which during the monsoons, the entire coastal belt have become uninhabitable. Sea surges, violent sea surges happen. Another issue with which I have been involved with in the past year is the lesser known and more silent impact of aggravated tidal flooding. So during the spring tide, when the tidal waters rise, previously, while those water used to enter only for a couple of weeks during the month of December, these days, for the past 5 or 6 years, water enters right from October. They start entering. In the video, as you saw, there are houses which have been surrounded by water for almost the entire year. And during the high tide season, these waters slowly enter your homes also. I had a dear boy tell me that, once the water starts entering home, he leaves this home. And then when he comes back, there are dead fishes inside. And so the question that I would like to pose here is a question of commons in this time of climate change. So it is not just the the physical coast, it is also a coast and a sea and an estuarine space which have become inimical. So previously, while your commons used to be a friend of yours, used to be a resource in a very economical term, which you could explore and which you could learn to make a living out of. In the time of climate change, these very same spaces have become alienated to you. You don't really understand your space anymore. And I'm talking about people who have lived in this landscape for centuries. I mean, when you look at their forefathers who have entered this land, who have made this land inhabitable. Even people who have been leading lives of knowledge in this landscape are left helpless. So it is this particular landscape and the common which has been alienated that we work with as a tech startup which is into climate solutions. And one way in which we have started dealing with this issue is to I think it connects back to the question that was raised as to who owns. So I think the ownership is not just about, about making a living out of it, about the livelihood aspects of it, about the resource sharing aspects of it. It is also about the solution building aspect of it, the resilience building aspect of it. Who builds solutions, who understands problems, who formulates problems, and who then formulates a solution to it also. So while our ways of dealing with an issue in times of more benign climate used to be where even if it is a very democratic government, there is a top-down way in which solutions are handed over to you. Even in a state like Kerala, where the Panchayati Raj systems are very strong. So we have a history of 25 years of very strong Panchayati Raj, where the people's planning had taken root. But even here, we have observed that after a period of 25-30 years, there has been a lot of loss of interest in engaging with solution building. So you've left it all to your local self-government bodies, and the local self-government bodies, on the other hand, have sublet it to contractors. And then it is at that space that solution building finally happens. So when we entered the coastal landscape, that is what struck us most. One is that there is a helplessness that is prevalent throughout, with the local self-government bodies, with the people, even with people who engage in nature-based livelihoods. That is when we started asking questions. How do you then build a model of surviving in this landscape? Because another solution that is in the making, that has not really come out now with its full force, is that of large-scale evictions from the coast. Because if it is not if, when the water starts to rise and enters the coast in the coming 15-20 years, there are going to be mass evictions from the coast. So there has to be and therefore getting back your ownership of the coast therefore becomes one of building your claims to the resources also. So therefore, in this solution building landscape, what we have been doing is to first build a monitoring system where we work along with the people, integrating their traditional knowledge systems and experiential knowledge of the commons, of the land, of the landscape, and integrate it with science-based solutions. So what we have started are monitoring systems in the coastal belt, where we monitor the level of the estuarine levels, the riverine levels, the groundwater levels, the tidal increase levels. So in the docu-shot, you found a person marking a calendar. So that calendar is where we ask people to mark the times of tidal rise and retreat. And when does it happen? How many days of the month does it happen? Because there are absolutely no records in the public sphere as to these new threats that the coastal regions are facing. And I don't think it is there in anybody's imagination that, you have 20,000 houses which are being inundated by salt water every day of the year, twice a day, in fact. So so in such a landscape, how do you formulate solutions, and how do you own these solutions? So we have, so this is a monitoring system that we have started on the basis of the data that comes in. The next step that we are moving towards is an impact-based forecast system, where we would be devising scenarios of various impacts that can happen, and what are the disaster scenarios that are in store for you. The second aspect of it is solution building, where we bring in together people's ideas, bring in people into detailed project making for a cluster that makes ecological sense, and then move into solution building with the collaboration of the local self-governments and the district disaster management agencies. So basically, it is a kind of reimagining the space of governance and of resilience, because we understand that what climate change has also provided us with is an opportunity, and that opportunity is that of building a creative commons. A creative commons where your knowledge, where your observations, where your historical understanding of the place that you have occupied can be a very strong weapon tool for you to reclaim your ownership on these lands. And unless and until that takes place now, in the very near future, you will be given a very paltry sum of compensation and be asked to move out of this space. And at that point of time, it won't be very easy to formulate solutions, because by then the landscape would have been totally and completely alienated. And there, in that alienation, there'll be two hands at work, not just that of the unseen global climate change, but also that of a very, very cunning and profit-mongering state. I think I'll stop here and then take questions, and then we'll move forward.
Thank you for leaving us with hope in the face of climate change, Sreeja. We now move on to the question and answer section. There are already quite a few questions, so I will take it in sequence. So I think Nupur has two questions. Maybe we'll take up the first one first. An important problem with the marine space is monitoring of any regulation put in place. Would you please comment on how you think this can be done better? Okay, anyone wants to take this?
I can do that. I think Sreeja already kind of talked. That was the crux of the message, I believe, is that, leveraging the power of the people in actually, not just in, so here, one of the issues that I see is, yes, monitoring, especially given the dissipated nature of fisheries. Like I said, it's huge, it's spread across the entire coastline, different kinds of issues at play. Now, just coming to say fisheries, for instance, fisheries management, for instance, a subject that I engage with, it's very difficult for one particular agency to monitor what's happening on the coast, to enforce these things. And it's usually the responsibility of the state right now, because people have been so disenfranchised and have no rights over their resources that there's no, and one of the major problems with at least the marine commons is that it is an open access. It's of completely open access nature, right? There's no, anyone can come and fish anywhere. There are some spatial regulations between mechanized and non-mechanized sectors, but otherwise it's pretty much open access. There's no, unless there are certain kinds of customary practices that, someone here flagged some of those kind of practices in place. Otherwise, it is extremely open access and anyone can fish anywhere. So, there's no incentive for a particular fisher community to protect and manage the ocean and the resources in their own backyards, because they put in all the effort, someone else can come and fish and go. So there is one very critical component to address at least the fisheries commons related issue is actually a lot more devolution of powers back to the communities and involve them in monitoring, right? Why are fisher communities' responsibility just to go and catch fish? Nothing else you can get involved in. Your job is to catch more and more fish. All the decisions and everything we will make, where you should live, how you should live, what you should catch, how much you should catch, all those things we will determine, but you all just go and catch fish, right? So even in actually forming these regulations, there's historically been no space for fishing communities to participate in it. And like Sreeja said, for us, monitoring is another very powerful tool where communities can actually even speak the language of data by actually being able for that boy to be, collecting rainfall data and to be able to see that, here is how the patterns have been changing in a way that science can't contest it, in a way that, just because of the language difference between the way science speaks and the way, communities and their ecological knowledge, their knowledge systems speak different languages, because they're not compatible doesn't mean you can't bridge those gaps. And I think giving them more power, empowering them a little bit more, there are now more village level committees and all of that, certain states have prescribed. They're all still in paper, but at least there seems to be some intent towards a little bit more decentralized kind of a management practice, which probably could ensure there is more. And unless people have been part of making decisions, why would they comply to some random decision someone else has made, right? That has no bearing for them in their day-to-day life. So not surprising that people are not complying with it. And most of the fishers that I've talked to, all of them say that give us some powers, we will take care of the the systems that we are depending on. It's not, we don't want to undermine the whatever, cut the branch that we are sitting on. Sorry, Amal.
Thank you. Do any of y'all have anything to add, or should I move on to the next question? Okay. We will take a question from another person. Given our extensive coastline, are there models and systems put into place by other developing countries that have been successful in inclusion in other regions like the Southeast or Africa's, that are models for us to base our policy and integration on? And are there examples of the same? This is by MD. It's open to all three of y'all.
Amal, go ahead and
Yeah, I think, I was trying to look for if there are good models. And in fact, means Naveen and I are involved in this project called Right Fish Matters, which is looking into the South and Southeast Asia, many countries. We have been also another group. We have been working on this Indian Ocean region, which includes Kenya and Cambodia, India, Sri Lanka. We are struggling to find cases where kind of an ideal utopic model that is available, that we can kind of take it as a blueprint to work around. What hopes we have got in some places are that where the community is proactive, there has been collectivization of community, they have put a force of resistance in some places to reclaim their own activities, livelihood, and space. And there are cases that is coming up in some places, like say in Kenya and Shimoni Venga, that area where the seaweed farmers, particularly women farmers, who they when they were engaged in their activity, and there was an iron and steel plant that came up, or planned to come up in that area, they collectivized and they protested against this, and they could stop those kind of activities. So similar such kind of activities you will find in bits and pieces here and there, that gives us hope. But looking for an ideal model, I think not only in the Indian Ocean region or the Asian or African region, but Europe also it is a contested space. In Latin America also it is a contested space, and these problems are kind of similar.
Yeah, just to add to that, I don't know if you even need to look for, ideal models elsewhere. I think if you're ready to listen, if you're ready to be more consultative, ready to sit down at a table and listen to multiple people, their experiences, their, dialogue, for instance, can help us build the right kind of model that is very relevant and contextual to our, our backgrounds and all this thing. I believe very strongly that there's enough knowledge and expertise within ourselves. It's just that we are not willing to look in the right places for it.
One thing that I'd like to add is that this again is related to tidal flooding. There has been complete lack of documentation and trying to understand the impacts of tidal flooding in the tropical areas. So we have been looking at other global studies to understand whether it is the same in other parts also. But at least in the global north, in the US West and East Coast, and in some parts of Europe too, they have started with documenting the impacts. So, and one very interesting study that I came across in a Nature paper was that they were recording the tidal heights using tweets. At that point of time, tweets could be geotagged. So they had asked people, Twitter users, to record the time and height of tidal ingress. Once they realized that there is a heightened tidal ingress into the land because of climate change. So that created a database. So what is actually, and because such studies had started earlier, there are also projections as to how far there are losses to infrastructure, damages to infrastructure in the coastal region because of continued tidal flooding. Because what is actually entering these coasts is salt water, and it can cause a lot of damage to your infrastructure. So what is the monetary values that you're looking at? So those studies have started to come out from there, whereas here we don't even have the basic data as to how much land is getting flooded, how much houses are being impacted, how many houses are being impacted, and what is the difference that has happened. Because these areas, low-lying areas, have been impacted due to, tidal ingress has been a very common phenomena even before. But what is the incremental change that has happened, and what is the rate of that change? So that kind of scientific understanding or studies is also missing, and it's in the tropical belt where these issues are actually much more magnified than in the global northern countries. That is one point. The second point, like Naveen said, it's very important that we understand and build models that are sui generis, which are our own, which is based on the knowledge, the historical as well as place-based knowledge of the people who are living in these parts. Because one thing that we are rich in is this data, and the thing that we are poor at is funds. When you look at the global north, there is no extent to which they can't go. You look at the example of Venice, the kind of heavily funded projects they're taking up to stop tidal flooding. In our coastal regions, one, we don't have the kind of commons to enter into that kind of solution building. It's heavily populated. Second, therefore, we have to understand the solution that the people have to offer. And there are. It is just that, like Naveen said, you have to listen to them and also to learn their language. It's high time we did that. Yeah.
Thank you. So we'll take the next question from Gopi M. I think this is directed at Naveen. He says, he says the Lakshadweep fishing community is also coming under marginalized community. I think that's a question. And then he says, because they are the major contributors in the local economy and they are getting lots of benefit from the government side.
Do they come under the marginalized community? If you mean economically, they are probably not as, as marginalized as some of the, many other villages I've worked in on the mainland coast. But nevertheless, they are marginalized in many other ways. A, because they live on islands. Living on islands is a different kind of marginalization altogether. They are a union territory, which means, again, Lakshadweep is a completely Islamic, group of islands with a matrilineal system, very unique. They have also fishing is one of their major, sources of income. Yes, there is, because they live on these islands in these difficult and, peripheral areas, there are government benefits that goes. A lot of them are being taken away from them as we speak. But yes, that doesn't mean that there is no marginalization. Like I said, they are literate, HDI wise, they are forward, but the kind of marginalization is very different in that they have no voice in what you can do. Like, I don't know if many of you are aware that there are, certain kinds of legislations, regulations that were brought in place, which kind of completely took away all the powers that community have in making any form of decisions whatsoever, basically even overriding constitutional rights of communities and all of that. So the marginalization doesn't always have to be economic, to weigh it only in terms of economic terms. It's also in terms of how much you're empowered. And if you use that metric, I would say they're still marginalized.
Thank you, Naveen. There is a question in the chat box from Satyajit Jana. He asks, what is the position now in India among actors like researchers, academicians, practitioners, CSOs together to map and work on coastal commons? Is there successful cases like Chilka movement that protected Ramsar site from shrimp cultivation of the Tatars? This is open to all.
Naveen, you can take it.
Yeah, I would say there are lots of attempts to kind of, someone here also mentioned that what you need is a spatial map, and what you need for coastal marine systems is a proper spatial planning. Right now, spatial planning on the one side can be beneficial, but the question is who decides, who does those spatial plannings, because it all depends on who's doing that spatial planning. Now, there are lots of people who are drawing maps and lines in the water based on the biodiversity, the ecological value. These areas in India is committed to 30 by 30, marine protected area and all of that. So, there are one bunch of people going out there and drawing lines everywhere, left, right, and center to kind of achieve that target, right? And there are others who are looking at it. There's blue economy, where there's a huge push to drive the maritime-based economy, right? So a huge port-based construction and all of that. So there are academicians, researchers, all of them involved in all of this. And I think there needs to be some kind of somehow conversation doesn't happen, right? And it's not always intentional to keep each other outside or, not to engage, but it's just because of the, because there are no spaces as such that facilitate these kind of conversations, right? In one district where I've been working, one of the district collector there has been very interested to actually set up something called a convergence unit, where basically all the different line departments, especially a fisheries related convergence unit for coastal and marine communities, which is basically all the different line departments come together and, ensure that there's no contradictory kind of interventions on the ground and kind of work together. Now it's easier said than done to actually get all these lines. And this is just within the government kind of machinery, right? Now, if you were to bring civil society organizations onto the table, nowadays there's huge distrust between, civil society organizations and the government machinery. So to kind of build that, one place where everyone can come and safely say things without having consequences, without having to, worry about how this will come back to bite your backs. That's, it's really important to have those kind of safe spaces, and those kind of spaces don't exist, unfortunately. There are organizations who try and work together, individuals who work together, but at a larger scale for that to happen, that requires a huge level of facilitation. Like you said, there are small victories that happen here and there, but collectively making an impact is not really happening at this stage.
To add to this, I would say that looking at the coast and marine space as a socio-ecological system, that is something I think within India there is a deficit in terms of where more and more people are required to kind of be sensitive around this particular aspect. That is a deficit that we generally see. There are several organizations actually, both the government, particularly the government organizations, if you can say that's CMFRI, CIFT, MPEDA, etc., are there, but they're more attuned to to the production system, where they look at this how much quantity or what is the size of the boat in horsepower, etc. That's how they kind of see the people, and the ecosystem somehow doesn't come into the picture to shape those ideas or thinking. And that is where I think even in terms of social scientists, when we're looking at this, saw that very few people who have kind of come into working on this are researching more in these areas and spaces. I think from that perspective, I think there is a huge requirement of more and more social ecological scientists to come into this fray and work, because the coastline is huge and every place itself kind of brings in a new dynamics to it. And this systems, the coastline itself is not a static thing. It is changing with the tidal movement, with the erosion and accretion. It is quite dynamic, and the species which kind of we harvested this year something, some other year something else. So this dynamism, keeping that dynamism in mind, I think there is a lot of dearth of kind of resources who can work on these spaces.
Sreeja, would you like to add anything? Or
well, I was just thinking that, in the East Coast, there is the Coastal Action Network. But the thing is, as the coastline is vast and wide, the issues are also very, very localized. There are overarching issues, but at the same time, the issues that come to a head that really is going to drive out of them out of the land or the water, or even cause death in worse scenarios, are very localized issues, like what we had in Vizhinjam in Trivandrum, or what is now happening in the Nairambalam region of Ernakulam district, because a sand bund which protected against sea surges has broken, and now the people are protesting there. And just a year back, the same protest had happened in Chellanam, because people wanted a sea wall there. They've been protesting for a year. A sea wall was built because of that huge protest. But then the nearby area of Kannamali started flooding, and that is happening even now. So even while I am adamant that people have to be part of solution building, there has to be a mass movement. There is also, therefore, a requirement of larger academic interest, larger research interest in these areas, because right now our solutions are very limited, very, very, very narrow. So if a sea surge is happening, you put a stone wall there, even though for years and years we have found out that solution does not work. So what is the alternative? So for that conversation to happen in that space, it just cannot be the people of the coast versus the state. There has to be a mix of more people with more voices, more authentic, in the sense, scientific voices, social voices. It has to come together. Our coasts have always been a marginalized space that way. I mean, nothing more to add right now. Yeah.
thank you. Okay, we would like to conclude this session. The Indian Commoner team extends our heartfelt gratitude to our panelists for their invaluable contributions, and also to the participants for enriching the discussions. We encourage all the participants to carry forward this discussion through the Indian Commoner Forum. The link is pasted in the chat. Have a good evening. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.